Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shekalim Daf Beis is the last daf in the Masechta. Contains two Mishnayos and a number of completely separate subjects. The first Mishnah introduces the topic of what happens when kudshim, carbon meat becomes tamei. Where is the appropriate place to burn it? The Gemara will analyze the four opinions in the Mishnah, four different approaches to this halacha. The Gemara will define some of the terms and have a machlokes about it and try to prove it from the Mishnah. Then we'll get to our second Mishnah, which discusses the unrelated topic of where you put the limbs of certain karbonos on their way up to being put on the mizbeach. And then the Mishnah finally returns to the topic of shkalim to close out the Masechta, and it talks about whether shkalim apply bizman hazeh, and are you allowed to be makder certain karbonos or set aside money for karbonos bizman hazeh when there's no Beis Hamikdash or not. So first of all, we're beginning with the first Mishnah on the daf, and we're discussing the topic of where you burn karbonos. So the halacha is karbonos which become tamei have to be burned. If it's kudshim, higher level karbonos like ola or chatas, they have to be burned in the azar. That's what the Torah says, specifically in the azar where they're not allowed to leave. That's where you're supposed to burn them. Now the Gemara says the Mishnah says there are exceptions to this rule, and the question is, where are these exceptions? So we're going to have four opinions here, but it's really an analysis of two factors. The two factors are, where did it become tamei? Did it become tamei in the azar or outside the azar? Obviously, if it became tamei in the azar, it's more likely that the halacha should be burned in the azar. It's there already. If it became tamei outside the azar, it's much harder to say you should bring it into the azar to burn it. So that's factor number one. Factor number two is, what type of tumah did it become tamei with? Was it an av ha-tumah or a vlad ha-tumah? A father tumah or a child tumah? The Gemara will have a machlokes defining what av ha-tumah and vlad ha-tumah mean. We'll just use those terms for now. And we have four opinions, four different tanaim in the Mishnah that define what are the situations in which these karbonos that became tamei should be burned in the azar. So the first opinion is Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says the only situation in which it be burned in the only situation in which it should be burned outside the azar is if you have both factors pointing to burning it outside the azar. That is, it became tamei outside the azar, and it's a very strict tumah. It's an av ha-tumah. You can't bring an av ha-tumah into the azar. If you don't have both those factors, then you will burn it inside the azara. So if it was either became tamei in the azara in the first place, or it was tamei only with a lighter tumah of vlada tumah, then you'll burn it inside the azara. Beis Hillel says the exact opposite. Beis Hillel says you only burn it inside the azara if you have both factors pointing towards burning it in the azara. That is, it's a light tumah, and it became tamei originally in the first place inside the azara. If, however, it's a strong tumah, or it got its original tumah outside the azara, then you'll burn it outside the azara. Now, Rabbi Eliezer says it doesn't go by that at all. It goes by what type of tumah it is only. If it was an ava tumah, then you will burn it outside the azara. You don't bring it into the azara. You don't have it be burned in the azara if it's an ava tumah. And if it's a vlada tumah, then you'll burn it inside the azara. It's a lighter tumah, you burn it inside the azara. We do not care where it became tamei. And Rabbi Kiva says the opposite. Rabbi Kiva says we only care where it became tamei. Wherever it became tamei, that's where you burn it. It doesn't make a difference what type of tumah it is. Whatever type of tumah it is, you burn it in the place in which it became tamei. Okay, now the Gemara discusses what is the term avatum and vadatum mean. So the Gemara is a machlokes between Bar Kapara and Rabbi Yochanan. Generally, before we get into it, avatuma is a source of tuma itself, something which is a tamei thing that passes on tuma to others. A vlada tuma is something which you got it from the av. It is a descendant of tuma. It became tamei from the original source of tuma. Now, most av hatumas are de'oraisa, or tuma de'oraisa. There are certain situations in which the chachamim gave a power of tuma to something that is tahor de'oraisa, and they gave it a power which parallels the av hatuma. So that's an av hatuma de'rabanan. So the Gemara says as follows. Bar Kapara says, when we say av hatuma, we mean tuma de'oraisa. We don't really mean a source of tuma. We mean tuma de'oraisa. If it's not tuma de'oraisa, it's not called av hatuma in this context. Vlada tuma, we mean tuma de'rabanan. Now Rabbi Yochanan says no, not necessarily. Both of them are talking about tuma de'oraisa. Avatuma is the source of tuma, and vlada tuma is something which became tamei from something else that could also be called that could also be tuma de'oraisa. You could have a rishon in the tuma de'oraisa, it became tamei from something else. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, all the tumas that are discussed in Mishnah are all tuma de'oraisa. So the Gemara says, so then I don't understand why there are some things that you will burn inside the azar and something which you'll burn outside the azar. The Gemara says, if it's all tumah daraisa, so what's the difference? Who cares what type of tumah it is? Now, the Gemara specifically first asks on Rabbi Yochanan, how do you understand Beis Shammai? Beis Shammai says that you will burn av hatuma that became tamei outside the azara. You'll burn it outside the azara. But if it's a vlad hatuma and became tamei outside the azara, you'll burn it inside the azara. What's the difference between an av and a vlad? Doesn't make any difference. They're both deraisa. We can understand the logic that if it's derabanan, so that means that midaraisa it's not tamei at all. So then I can bring it into the azara. You can fulfill the mitzvah deraisa of burning it in the azara because deraisa it has no tumah. But if they're both vlad and av are tumah deraisa, so who cares where it be? Why should there be any reason? Who cares if it's a vlad or an av? If they're both deraisa, you should have the same halacha. It shouldn't make a difference to where you burn it. The Gemara says the same question could be asked in Beis Hillel. In Beis Hillel, there's a difference between two vlad hatumas. A vlad hatuma, there's a difference between a vlad hatuma and an avatuma where it became tamei inside. Right? According to Beis Hillel, if it's a vlad hatuma that became tamei inside the azara, you'll burn it inside. And if it's a vlad hatuma that became tamei outside the azara, you'll burn it outside. So the Gemara says you should have the same question. What difference does it make where it became tamei? If they're both vlad hatuma, if they're both tumah deraisa, av and vlad should not make a difference at all. The Gemara does not answer according to Rabbi Yechanan, but the Gemara does say that you have similar kashas on Bar Kapara, but those you can answer. The Gemara says on Bar Kapara, you're telling me that Avatum is Tumah Deraisa, Vladatum is Tumah Derabana. The Gemara says, but I don't understand something. In Avatumah, which is all Tumah Deraisa, according to Beis Shammai, there's a different halacha whether it became Tamei inside or became Tamei outside. If it became Tamei outside, you'll burn it outside the azara. If it became tamei inside the azara, you'll burn it inside the azara. Why should that make a difference? It's all tumah deraisa. So who cares where it became tamei? So Gemara says that's not so shver. That we could understand because we have Rabbi Akiva's svar that it's logical. You should burn it in the place in which it became tamei. You should not bring it into the azara in the first place if it became tamei outside the azara. The Gemara says, well, I could ask a very similar kash according to Beis Hillel. How will Bar Kapara understand Beis Hillel? According to Beis Hillel, if it's a vlad hatuma, there's a difference between inside and outside. If it's a vlad hatuma, if it became tamei outside, it'll be burned outside. If it became tamei inside, it'll be burned inside. The Gemara says, how do you understand that? Why should it make a difference over there? So the Gemara says, here it's a different svara. Here, there's the svara of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds that every type of tumah has to be sent out of the camp, even something which is a vlad hatum, even something which became tamei from something else, even a rishon tumah, sheni tumah. Every type of tumah has to be sent outside the camp, and therefore we'll send it out. Anything which became tamei outside will have to stay out, and that is what Beis Hillel's svara is, that it makes a difference whether it was inside or outside, even though we're talking about a vlad hatumah, something which is not tamei deraisa, according to Bar Kapar. Okay, this concludes the Gemara's commentary on the first Mishnah. Now we begin the second Mishnah. The Mishnah has two completely separate things. The first part is discussed by the Mefarshim as to what it's doing here and how it fits in. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything. The Mishnah notes that when parts of certain karbanos were brought up to the Mizbeach, they weren't brought straight up from the place where they were slaughtered onto the Mizbeach into the fire. They were left on a certain spot on the ramp, on the kevesh, the ramp leading up to the Mizbeach. There's a spot where they were left. And then it was moved from there. So the Mishnah says where the specific karbanos were left. So it says the karban tamid, which is the most chashav, the most important of the karbanos. The parts which go on the Mizbeach were placed on the bottom half of the ramp, the lower half, on the western side. Why? Well, if it's further from the ramp, then it's more chashav, because then it's a bigger, more visible trip to actually bring it onto the Mizbeach itself. And the west is more chashav because the west is closer to the Shechina, the place of the Shechina, which is the west in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Now, the Gemara says that if it's a karban musaf, which is brought on every Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh, so if it's a karban musaf of Yom Tov and of Shabbos, then it's put on the lower half of the ramp, but on the eastern side. And the reason why it's on the eastern side is because we don't want to confuse the karbanos, the parts of the different karbanos. We want to know what's what. And sometimes the musaf was slaughtered before the tamid was put in the fire, and therefore you both would be on the ramp at the same time. We want to keep them separate. So these parts went on the eastern side. However, it was also considered chashav, so it went in the lower part of the ramp. Now the Gemara says, however, the karban musaf of Rosh Chodesh, that didn't rest or pause on the ramp. It went all the way up to the top of the ramp on a place on the Mizbeach called a karkoiv. The Gemara explains karkoiv is the area about 1 amma wide between the corner pieces of the Mizbeach. That Mizbeach had corner pieces, an amma by an amma in each corner. So the strip, the amma wide strip between each piece, that was called a karkoiv, and that's where the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh was placed. And the reason it was placed there was that it was high up, and we wanted to publicize the fact that today's Rosh Chodesh, so Klal Yisrael should know what the date is. They should be able to calculate their Yom Tovim based off that. Okay, now, second half of the Mishnah is a totally different topic. It goes back to the subject of Shekalim and discusses whether Shekalim apply Bisman Hazeh, that there's no Beis HaMikdash or not. The Mishnah says Shekalim do not apply Bisman Hazeh. Shekalim and Bikurim, you cannot have Machatzis a shekel without a Beis HaMikdash, and you cannot have the mitzvah of Bikurim, bringing your first fruits to Yerushalayim. You don't have those two mitzvahs when there is no Beis HaMikdash. However, Meiser of grain, Meiser of animals, setting aside a tenth of your grain and a tenth of your animals for Kahuna and Leviah, that you do have. Bechor, which has to go to Kahanim, that you do have. These three things do apply today, and you do have to set these parts, these things aside. And we can't necessarily be given to Kohanim, but as far as halacha of having to separate them, you do definitely have to separate them. So now the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, what happens if somebody is makdish shkalim and bikurim? We said he's not supposed to, there is no mitzvah. What happens if somebody says, these are shkalim, these are bikurim? So the Tanna Kama says they get kedusha, and you have to be careful with them. You can't use them for your own sake. They have kedusha. The shkalim have kedusha, and the animal and the fruits that you were makdish as bikurim have kedusha. And Reb Shimon disagrees. Reb Shimon says, no, Bikurim do not have Kedusha. The Gemara will discuss whether or not he argues on Shkalim as well. First, the Gemara comments on the subject of the Karban Musaf and the Karban Tamid on the Karban Musaf of Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh. And the Gemara asks, when Shabbos falls out on Rosh Chodesh, you have two Musafim, the Musaf of Shabbos and Musaf of Rosh Chodesh, which one gets brought first? We know the Karban Tamid is before everything, but these two Musafs, which one goes first? So interestingly, Rabbi Yirmiyah says that Rosh Chodesh goes first, and the proof is that there's a Mishnah that clearly says that the Leviim who sang Shira, they sang a specific Shira for each day. They sang it at the time that the Karban Musaf was brought. So they sang the Shira for Rosh Chodesh first. The Shira that they sang for Rosh Chodesh was before Shabbos, when Shabbos fell on Rosh Chodesh. So obviously, you see, the Karban for Rosh Chodesh was brought before the Karban for Shabbos. So Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says, no, actually the Karban for Shabbos was brought first. It had to be brought first, because you have a rule, Tamid, Tadir, Veshene Tadir, Tadir, Kaidim, anything which comes more often, comes first, and Shabbos comes more often. Shabbos comes once a week, as opposed to Rosh Chodesh, which comes once a month. So you have to bring the Karban Musaf for Shabbos before. Now, as far as the Shira, it's not a problem. The Shira was loud, and the Shira was something people heard. It wasn't just the Karban being brought, and it was very important, like we said in the Mishnah, that people should know when Rosh Chodesh is. So in order to advertise when Rosh Chodesh is, they sang the Shira of Rosh Chodesh first, and they sang it actually while they were bringing the Karban Musaf for Shabbos. They brought the Karban Musaf for Shabbos and sang the Shira of Rosh Chodesh, and then vice versa later. All right, now back to Shekalim. So our Mishnah had clearly indicated that Reb Shimon does not argue about Shekalim, and Reb Shimon agrees that if you're makdish Shekalim Bisman Hazeh, it has Kedusha. So Gemara says that is disputed by a different version of Reb Shimon, brought by Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, quoting Reb Shimon, and he says that even Shekalim have no Kedusha. So we have a machlokes definitely between Reb Shimon and Tanna Kama about Bikurim, and now we have a machlokes Amoraim. What does Reb Shimon hold about Shekalim? According to our Mishnah, our Mishnah's version, Reb Shimon holds that Shekalim, if you makdish them, they have Kedusha, just like Bikurim, according to the Tanna Kama. And Rabbi Yehuda, Reb Shimon ben Yehuda's version says that Reb Shimon holds that Shekalim do not have Kedusha. Now the Gemara goes on to a related subject, and also halacha of Reb Shimon, and that what happens if a ger, somebody who converts. So in times of the Beis HaMikdash, he had to bring a pair of birds as his carbon. So the Gemara quotes a brisa that says that today, when he can't bring a carbon because there's no Beis HaMikdash, somebody who converts has to set aside the minimum amount of money that he needs to buy a pair of birds, so that he could bring it as a carbon right away when the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt, speedily in our days. How much is that? A quarter of 1 silver coin, 1 silver dinar, a very small amount. He has to set it aside. So Gemara says that Reb Shimon quotes a Berachan and says they cancel this. They said don't do that. Because what's going to happen is that you're going to have this money lying around. You're going to end up using it, and it's hektish. You set it aside as hektish to bring karbonos. We don't want hektish money lying around, people will end up using it for their own sake, and therefore we cancel this practice. The Gemara says, where do you see this concept that we cancel the practice of being makdish things in our days? The Gemara says there's a brisa that says you're not allowed to be makdish things, you're not allowed to be marich, that's to pledge your value or somebody else's value, you're not allowed to be machrem, it's also a type of hektish. In our days, you're not allowed to do any of these things. And if somebody does these things, whatever he was machrem or makdish or marich, has to be destroyed because it has kedusha, and you got to destroy it. So if it's clothing, you have to burn it. If it's an animal, you have to lock it up in a room and let it starve to death. If it's a coin, you have to throw it in the Yam HaMelach. So you see that clearly we are trying to cancel these things. So now the Gemara has a question. The Gemara says, what if the ger goes ahead and he's makdish it anyway? He takes this money and he sets it aside. What will be the psak? So the Gemara says, well, based on what Rabbi Shimon said, Rabbi Yochanan said that we canceled it because we don't want problems to happen. You see from that if he would do it, it would get kedusha. So obviously there is kedusha. So the Gemara says, I don't understand you. You're telling me that Rabbi Shimon, before you told me Rabbi Shimon agrees that if somebody's makdish shkalim, it does not have kedusha. And here you're telling me if somebody's makdish these coins, it has kedusha. Both of these are money being set aside. And in both cases, the potential problem, is that you can end up using it. And when you tell me it has kedusha, when you tell me it does not have kedusha. What is the understanding of that? That seems contradictory. Gemara says it's not a contradiction. There's a very simple difference between the two. If the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt today, and hopefully it'll be rebuilt today, and we'll have it, the shkalim you were makdish are still not going to be brought as shkalim, because we'll make a new collection. The Beis HaMikdash will probably be rebuilt on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, just like the Mishkan was built on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and there's going to be a new collection of shkalim, and that new collection will be what will be used for karbanos. So even the shekel you were makdish still won't be used. So what's the point in being makdish? You're better off not doing it. However, the ger who's makdish is karbanos, he will be able to bring it as soon as the Beis HaMikdash is built. Let it be today. Now the Gemara concludes the Masechta with a psak in the Machlokes as to whether bikurim that you set aside today have kedusha or not. The Gemara says that Rav Hamnuna and Rav Ada bar Ava said the name of Rav. The halacha is like Rabbi Shimon that they do not have kedusha. Hadron aloch Meseches Shkalim.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.